At our 25th wedding anniversary dinner, my husband Marcus proudly introduced me to his new wife and announced they were getting married next month. What he didn't know was that the merger documents in my briefcase would make him unemployed before the champagne finished bubbling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandeliers of Bellmont Country Club cast their elegant glow across the private dining room as I watched my husband of 25 years escort a woman young enough to be our daughter to what should have been our intimate anniversary celebration. Victoria Sterling, 28, radiant in a champagne-colored cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, settled gracefully into the chair that had been meant for just the two of us. "Catherine, I'd like you to meet Victoria," Marcus said with the same commanding presence he used when addressing juries, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. "She'll be my wife starting November 15th. Those words hung in the air like a death sentence, shattering the carefully planned evening I'd been orchestrating for months. 25 years of marriage reduced to a casual introduction over aperitifs. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd chosen Bellmont specifically for tonight, knowing it would provide the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. Victoria shifted slightly in her seat, her emerald engagement ring catching the light as she nervously smoothed her dress. The ring was massive, at least 4 carats, and I recognized the setting immediately. It was from Cartier's newest collection, the same one I'd admired in their catalog just last month. Marcus had clearly spared no expense in securing his trophy wife's affections. "I thought we should all have dinner together," Marcus continued, pouring himself a glass of the 2010 Dom Perignon I'd specifically ordered, our traditional anniversary champagne, now serving as a prop in his twisted theater. "Clear the air before the wedding, no need for drama or lawyers." The sheer audacity took my breath away. He'd actually convinced himself this was a mature, sophisticated approach to ending our marriage. That I should be grateful for his honesty, appreciative of being included in the celebration of my own replacement. I studied Victoria's face as she avoided direct eye contact, focusing instead on the elaborate table setting. There was something almost rehearsed about her demeanor, the way she sat with perfect posture, the careful modulation of her voice when she whispered, "It's lovely to finally meet you, Catherine." She was nervous, certainly, but there was calculation behind those doe eyes. This wasn't just about love, this was strategic. "How thoughtful of both of you," I replied, lifting my champagne flute with a steady hand. My voice remained calm, controlled, betraying none of the satisfaction building in my chest. "To new beginnings." Marcus smiled, clearly pleased with what he interpreted as my gracious acceptance of the situation. He'd always underestimated me, mistaking my quiet strength for submission, my patience for weakness. In his mind, I was the dutiful corporate wife who'd spent 25 years hosting his law firm's holiday parties, attending bar association dinners, and turning a blind eye to his increasingly frequent client meetings that ran late into the night. What Marcus didn't realize, as he confidently outlined his vision for our amicable divorce, was that Victoria's designer handbag contained more than just lipstick and breath mints. Those hushed phone calls she'd been making during their romantic getaways weren't to her mother or her girlfriends. They were to someone much more interesting. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught the nervous perspiration forming along Victoria's hairline as I reached into my own briefcase. My fingers brushed against the leather portfolio that would change everything. Documents that had arrived just this morning. Documents that would shatter the fantasy they'd built together. "Before we discuss the future," I said, maintaining my composed smile, "I think there's something you both should see." Marcus's brow furrowed slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "What do you mean?" I pulled out the portfolio with deliberate slowness, aware of how both their eyes followed my movements. Inside were documents that represented months of careful investigation, strategic planning, and patient execution. But this was just the beginning, the key that would unlock a cascade of revelations neither of them saw coming. "You know, Marcus, in all our years together, you've never really asked about the specifics of my work," I continued, breaking the wax seal on the portfolio. "Specifically, my role in the corporate restructuring business." The color began to drain from Victoria's face. She knew exactly what this meant because she'd been anticipating this moment since the night she'd made a crucial mistake 3 weeks ago. "What is this?" Marcus demanded, his courtroom authority wavering for the first time that evening. "The truth," I replied simply, pulling out the first document. "Starting with the fact that Sterling & Associates, the boutique investment firm that's been advising you on the law firm's expansion, doesn't actually exist." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as Marcus's confident world began to crumble piece by piece. Victoria's hand flew to her throat, a tell I'd noticed during our previous encounters when she was lying. But this was just the opening move in a game I'd been playing since I first discovered their affair 8 months ago. Every Tuesday evening when Marcus claimed to be working late on the Patterson merger, every weekend golf trip with potential clients, every suspicious credit card charge at restaurants I'd never visited. While he thought he was being cleverly discreet, I'd been building a case that would destroy not just his marriage, but his career, his reputation, and his carefully constructed image of himself as the brilliant legal mind behind Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. The investment fraud was devastating, but it was far from the only surprise I had planned for tonight. Those business expansion plans Victoria had been so enthusiastic about? The ones that required Marcus to leverage the firm's assets as collateral? All part of an elaborate scheme that would have left him bankrupt and disbarred within 6 months. But first, I wanted to savor this moment. Watching the man who'd treated me like an aging accessory realize that his young bride had been playing him just as thoroughly as he'd been playing me. "This has to be wrong," Marcus whispered, staring at the investment fraud documentation. "Victoria's firm has an impeccable reputation. They've been featured in Financial Times." I smiled, finally allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "Oh, darling, this is just the beginning. Tonight wasn't about ending our marriage. It was about revealing the true scope of everyone's deceptions, including mine." The evening was still young, and I had so much more to show them. The next few hours would reveal the true cost of underestimating Catherine Hartwell, and they were about to learn that some women should never be crossed. As I watched them both struggle to process what they'd just learned, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The performance was almost over, and soon it would be time for the real show to begin. The woman who had walked into Bellmont Country Club tonight was not the same person who would walk out. 25 years of marriage had forged something far more dangerous than either of them could imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The appetizers arrived with perfect timing, seared scallops with truffle oil that none of us would touch, too focused on the psychological warfare unfolding across the pristine white tablecloth. Marcus, however, reached for his water glass with the desperation of a man whose mouth had gone completely dry. "Victoria," I said, turning my attention to the young woman who was now gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Tell me about your background in investment management. I'm particularly curious about your credentials from Wharton." Victoria's eyes darted to Marcus, seeking rescue from a man who was still staring at the fraud documentation with growing horror. My education speaks for itself," she managed, her voice losing the confident tone she'd maintained earlier. "Of course it does," I agreed, producing another document from my portfolio, which is why I found it so interesting when Wharton's alumni office confirmed they have no record of a Victoria Sterling in their MBA program. Ever. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Marcus looked up from the papers, his legal mind finally catching up to the implications of what he was seeing. The woman he'd planned to marry, the financial advisor who'd convinced him to restructure his entire law firm, didn't exist in any official capacity. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Years of cross-examining witnesses had taught him to recognize the signs of deception, and he was finally seeing them clearly in the woman sitting beside him. "No mistake," I replied calmly, opening to a new section of documents. "Victoria Sterling is a complete fabrication. The woman sitting next to you is actually Amanda Walsh, age 31, originally from Denver, Colorado. She has quite an interesting employment history." I spread out a series of surveillance photographs across the table, like a dealer revealing a winning hand. The images showed Victoria Amanda meeting with various men in expensive restaurants, hotel lobbies, and private clubs across the country. Each photograph was time-stamped and location-stamped, creating an undeniable pattern of behavior. Miami, 2019, I said, pointing to the first photo. You convinced real estate developer James Morrison to invest his entire portfolio in a cryptocurrency scheme that vanished overnight. Portland, 2021. Tech entrepreneur Michael Chen lost his software company after following your advice to leverage everything for a quote 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 quote. Amanda's carefully constructed facade was crumbling with each revelation. The confident young businesswoman had been replaced by someone who looked like a cornered animal, desperately searching for an escape route that didn't exist. And then there's San Francisco 2022, I continued, producing the most damning photograph yet, where you convinced venture capitalist Robert Blackstone to mortgage his family's estate to fund what you called the investment opportunity of a lifetime. He lost everything. His wife left him, he declared bankruptcy, and last I heard he was working as a night security guard just to pay rent. Marcus was now studying the photographs with the methodical attention he usually reserved for case files. The pattern was unmistakable. Amanda Walsh was a professional con artist who specialized in seducing successful men and destroying their lives for profit. The beautiful thing about digital forensics, I said, withdrawing a tablet from my briefcase, is that everything leaves a trail. Bank transfers, email communications, even deleted text messages can be recovered with the right expertise. I turned the tablet screen toward them, revealing a comprehensive timeline of Amanda's activities over the past 18 months. Her real name, her previous victims, her current financial accounts, and, most damning of all, her communications with a network of accomplices who specialized in identity theft and financial fraud. Marcus, you weren't randomly selected, I explained, watching as the color drained from his face. You were specifically targeted because of your position at Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. Amanda spent 3 months researching your habits, your finances, your vulnerabilities before she ever approached you at that bar association mixer. The tablet showed detailed notes about Marcus's routine, his favorite restaurants, his golf schedule, even his preferred brands of scotch and wine. The level of preparation was staggering, revealing an operation that was far more sophisticated than a simple romance scam. The law firm expansion you've been planning? I continued, scrolling through more documents. The one that requires you to use the firm's assets as collateral for a $15 million loan? That was never about growing your practice. It was about creating liquid assets that could be siphoned off through a series of shell companies. I showed them bank routing numbers, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, and offshore account information. All the infrastructure needed to steal millions of dollars and disappear without a trace. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Amanda here would have played the devoted wife for exactly long enough to gain access to the firm's financial systems, I explained. Then, one morning, you would have woken up to find your business accounts emptied, your credit destroyed, and your marriage to a woman who never existed in the first place. Marcus was now physically shaking as he absorbed the full magnitude of how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. This wasn't just a midlife crisis affair that had gone wrong. It was a calculated attack on everything he'd spent his career building. But here's what really interests me, I said, leaning forward with the expression of a chess player who'd been planning this move for months. The timing of your approach to Amanda wasn't random either. You see, someone with inside knowledge of our marriage, our finances, and our vulnerabilities would have been necessary to make you such an attractive target. I produced another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of a prestigious private investigation firm. The surveillance reports detailed Marcus's activities over the past 2 years, documenting his growing dissatisfaction with our marriage, his increasing alcohol consumption, and his susceptibility to flattery from younger women. These reports were commissioned 18 months ago, I said, watching Amanda's face go white as she realized the implications. The question is, who was gathering intelligence on my husband long before Amanda Walsh ever appeared in his life? The answer to that question would shatter everything they thought they knew about tonight's revelations. But I wasn't quite ready to play that card yet. Let them marinate in the horror of what they'd already learned. You're lying, Amanda said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. None of this is real. You're just a jealous wife trying to break us up. I smiled at her desperation. recognizing the final gambit of someone who'd run out of options. "Amanda, darling, I've been documenting your activities since the day you walked into Marcus's life. Every restaurant where you met, every hotel where you stayed, every lie you told about your background. I have recordings of your phone calls, copies of your bank transactions, even video footage of you meeting with your accomplices." The tablet screen now showed a grid of security camera footage from various locations around the city. Amanda appeared in dozens of clips, always meeting with the same group of individuals who operated what amounted to a criminal enterprise specializing in romance fraud and identity theft. "The man you call your business partner? His real name is David Chen, and he's wanted by the FBI for wire fraud in 17 states. The woman who supposedly handles your quote, client relations, Sarah Martinez, has been running inheritance scams across the Southwest for the past 5 years. Marcus was staring at the evidence with the expression of a man watching his own professional destruction. Every document he'd signed, every financial decision he'd made based on Amanda's advice, every step toward restructuring his law firm, all of it had been orchestrated to facilitate the largest theft of his career. "The beautiful irony," I continued, "is that you actually chose your mark perfectly. Marcus does have access to substantial assets, and his law firm would have been an ideal target for the kind of sophisticated financial fraud you specialize in. You just made one crucial miscalculation." I closed the tablet and returned it to my briefcase, letting the weight of anticipation build between us. The evening was still young, and I had so much more to reveal. But first, I wanted them to fully appreciate the scope of their predicament. "You assumed I was just another corporate wife, content to host dinner parties and spend my husband's money while remaining blissfully ignorant of his business affairs," I said, my voice taking on an edge that neither of them had heard before. "You had no idea who you were really dealing with." The transformation was beginning. The quiet, accommodating woman they thought they knew was revealing herself to be something far more dangerous. And the evening's biggest revelations were still to come. The waiter approached our table with practiced discretion, clearly sensing the tension but maintaining his professional composure as he refilled our water glasses and discreetly cleared the untouched appetizers. The other diners in Bellmont's elegant dining room continued their conversations, blissfully unaware that at table 7, a carefully orchestrated takedown was unfolding with surgical precision. "Those surveillance reports I mentioned," I said once we were alone again, "the ones commissioned 18 months ago to gather intelligence on Marcus's vulnerabilities, they weren't ordered by Amanda's criminal network. They were commissioned by someone much closer to home." I withdrew a new folder from my briefcase, this one bearing the official seal of Morrison Investigative Services, one of Chicago's most prestigious private investigation firms. The cover letter was addressed to someone whose name would send shockwaves through everything they thought they understood about tonight's revelations. The client who paid $75,000 for a comprehensive background investigation into Marcus Hartwell's personal life, financial situation, and psychological profile, I continued, opening the folder with deliberate slowness, was someone who had intimate access to our home, our schedules, and our most private conversations. Marcus leaned forward, his legal instincts finally overriding his emotional devastation. Years of courtroom experience had taught him to follow the evidence wherever it led, even when it led somewhere he didn't want to go. "The investigation was commissioned by Elena Morrison," I announced, placing the contract on the table between us. "Our housekeeper of 12 years. The woman we trusted with our home security codes, our travel schedules, and our most private family moments." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Elena had been more than just household staff. She'd been family. We'd attended her daughter's graduation, helped pay for her son's medical treatments, and trusted her with details of our lives that we'd never shared with anyone else. "Elena has been feeding information to Amanda's criminal network for over 2 years," I continued, producing bank statements that showed regular payments from the same offshore accounts that had funded Amanda's operation. "Your golf schedule, your favorite restaurants, your drinking habits, even your complaints about our marriage during those late-night phone calls with your law partners. Elena documented everything." The surveillance reports painted an intimate portrait of Marcus's life that only someone with complete access to our home could have compiled. They knew his morning routine, his preferred breakfast, the exact time he left for work each day. They knew about his secret smoking habit, his tendency to work late when stressed, and most damaging of all, his growing resentment toward what he perceived as my lack of ambition. Elena recorded our private conversations, I said, producing a series of audio transcripts that made Marcus's face go pale, including the one where you told your brother that you felt trapped in our marriage and wished you could start over with someone who understood your ambitions. The transcripts were devastating in their intimacy, revealing Marcus's private thoughts and vulnerabilities that Amanda had then exploited with surgical precision. Every complaint he'd made about our relationship, every expression of dissatisfaction with his life, had been weaponized against him by people who saw his emotional needs as nothing more than entry points for financial exploitation. But Elena's betrayal goes deeper than simple surveillance, I continued, opening to a new section of documents that would reshape their understanding of the entire conspiracy. She didn't just gather information, she actively sabotaged our marriage to make you more susceptible to outside manipulation. The evidence was damning. Elena had been intercepting our mail, including invitations to social events that might have strengthened our relationship. She'd been deleting messages from the home answering machine, ensuring that small gestures of affection never reached their intended recipient. Most insidiously, she'd been subtly poisoning our relationship by sharing selective information that painted each of us in the worst possible light to the other. "Remember the surprise birthday party I supposedly forgot to plan for your 50th? I asked, watching recognition dawn in Marcus's eyes. I spent weeks coordinating with Elena to arrange everything. The reservation confirmations, the guest list, the custom menu, all of it disappeared from my home office the day before your birthday." Marcus's hands were trembling as he absorbed the implications. The growing distance in our marriage, the accumulating resentments, the sense that we'd become strangers living in the same house. Much of it had been artificially orchestrated by someone we'd trusted implicitly. "Elena has been running similar operations against other wealthy families across the country," I explained, spreading out a map that showed the locations of various cons and the timeline of Elena's employment with different households. She works for a year or two, gathering intelligence and creating vulnerabilities, then moves on to a new city when her targets have been successfully compromised. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. Elena would gain employment with affluent families, particularly those with successful husbands who might be susceptible to midlife crisis manipulation. She'd document their routines, identify their weaknesses, and then coordinate with criminal networks to exploit those vulnerabilities through romance scams, investment fraud, or elaborate inheritance cons. The Richardsons in Beverly Hills lost $3.2 million after their housekeeper, Elena, using the name Maria Santos, helped set up a fake art investment scheme, I said, pointing to one of the case files. The Pemberton family in Boston had their entire real estate portfolio stolen through fraudulent power of attorney documents that Elena helped forge. Amanda was now openly crying, mascara running down her cheeks as she realized the scope of the criminal enterprise she'd become entangled with. What she'd thought was a sophisticated but contained operation was actually part of a nationwide network that had destroyed dozens of families over the past decade. "The beautiful thing about Elena's method," I continued, "is that her victims rarely suspect the betrayal came from inside their own homes. They blame themselves for bad investments, failed marriages, or poor judgment. They never realize they were targeted by professionals who spent months or years preparing for their destruction." I produced photographs taken by private investigators I'd hired to track Elena's activities over the past 6 months. The images showed her meeting with known criminals, exchanging envelopes of cash, and coordinating with the same network of identity thieves and con artists that had produced Amanda Walsh. "Elena has been preparing you for Amanda's arrival since the day she started working for us," I explained to Marcus. "Every piece of information Amanda used to seduce you, every vulnerability she exploited, every psychological pressure point she targeted, all of it came from Elena's detailed reports about your character and circumstances. The coordination between the inside intelligence and the external manipulation was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Elena had even influenced Marcus's schedule to ensure he'd be at the Bar Association mixer where Amanda first approached him, creating what seemed like a chance encounter, but was actually a carefully orchestrated meeting. "But here's what really interests me about Elena's operation," I said, leaning back in my chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. "She made one crucial mistake that unraveled the entire conspiracy. I withdrew a single sheet of paper from the folder. A bank transfer receipt that seemed innocuous, but would prove to be the thread that unraveled everything. 3 months ago, Elena needed to send emergency funds to her real family in Mexico. Her daughter was in a car accident and needed immediate surgery. In her panic, she used her real bank account instead of the one connected to her false identity. The transaction had created a digital paper trail that connected Elena Morrison, trusted housekeeper, to Elena Vasquez, wanted criminal with warrants in 7 states for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Elena Vasquez has been running household infiltration schemes for 12 years, I said, producing an FBI wanted poster that showed Elena's photograph alongside a list of her known aliases and criminal activities. She's responsible for coordinating thefts totaling over $47 million from families who trusted her with their most intimate secrets. Marcus stared at the wanted poster with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of reality had been shattered. The woman who'd made his morning coffee for 12 years, who'd decorated our Christmas tree and helped plan our anniversary celebrations, was actually a career criminal who'd been systematically destroying our lives while we paid her to do it. The federal authorities have been tracking Elena's network for 3 years, I continued, but she's been too careful, too thorough in her identity management. Until now. Amanda looked up through her tears, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since the evening began. Perhaps she thought this revelation might somehow absolve her of her own crimes, that she could claim to be as much a victim of Elena's manipulation as Marcus had been. But I wasn't finished. The evening's biggest revelations were still to come, and Amanda was about to learn that her problems went far deeper than a partnership with a career criminal. "You see, Amanda," I said, my voice taking on a tone that was almost conversational. "While I was investigating Elena's criminal background, I discovered something interesting about your own past. Something that changes everything about why you're really here tonight." The promise of more devastating revelations hung in the air between us. The criminal conspiracy they'd thought they understood was about to reveal layers of deception that none of them had anticipated. The evening was far from over, and the true scope of everyone's betrayals was still waiting to be unveiled. The main courses arrived as if summoned by the dramatic pause in our conversation. Prime rib for Marcus, salmon for Amanda, and the duck confit I'd specifically ordered because it was Marcus's least favorite dish. Small acts of rebellion that only I understood, tiny assertions of independence that helped maintain my composure while delivering devastating revelations. "Amanda," I said, cutting into my duck with surgical precision, "before we continue, I think it's important that Marcus understands exactly who you really are. Not just Amanda Walsh, career criminal, but your connection to something much more personal." I withdrew a leather portfolio that had been hidden beneath all the other documents. This one bearing the embossed seal of a law firm that would make Marcus's blood run cold. The letterhead read Pemberton Hayes & Associates, the prestigious Boston firm that had been Marcus's biggest professional rival for the past decade. "Your real name isn't Amanda Walsh," I announced, opening the portfolio to reveal a Massachusetts driver's license and social security card. "It's Amanda Pemberton, daughter of senior partner Harrison Pemberton, the man who cost Marcus the Morrison Industries account 3 years ago." The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications hit him like a freight train. Harrison Pemberton had been more than just a professional rival. He'd been Marcus's law school roommate, his best man, his closest friend, until a bitter falling out over a client poaching incident that had destroyed their relationship and split the legal community in Boston. "You remember Harrison, don't you, darling?" I continued, watching Marcus's hands begin to tremble. "Your former best friend who stole the Morrison Industries account by allegedly using confidential information he'd gained during your partnership discussions? The case that would have made your career?" Amanda, I could no longer think of her by her assumed name, was staring at me with undisguised horror. Her elaborate con wasn't just about money. It was about revenge, orchestrated by a family that had been nursing a grudge for years. "The beautiful thing about the legal community," I said, producing a series of correspondence between Harrison Pemberton and various private investigators, "is how small it really is. Grudges last for decades, and successful lawyers have long memories and substantial resources for settling old scores. The documents revealed a 3-year plan to destroy Marcus's career and reputation, orchestrated by Harrison Pemberton and funded through his law firm's special projects account. The plan had multiple phases. Infiltrate Marcus's household through Elena, gather compromising information about his personal and professional life, and then send his own daughter to seduce and destroy him through financial fraud. Harrison has been planning this since the Morrison Industries verdict, I explained, spreading out email communications that showed the meticulous planning behind Amanda's appearance in Marcus's life. He couldn't beat you in court, so he decided to destroy you personally. Marcus was now reading the emails with the desperate attention of a man searching for some escape from an impossible situation. The messages between Harrison and Amanda revealed a level of personal animosity that went far beyond professional rivalry. This was about humiliation, about making Marcus pay for perceived betrayals that had festered for years. "Make him fall in love with you," I read from one of Harrison's emails to his daughter. "Get him to trust you completely, then take everything he's worked for. I want him to lose his firm, his reputation, and his sanity. The same way he destroyed my faith in friendship and partnership." The vendetta was breathtaking in its cruelty and scope. Harrison hadn't just wanted to beat Marcus professionally. He'd wanted to obliterate him personally, using his own daughter as the weapon of destruction. Amanda's seduction wasn't just about accessing your law firm's assets, I continued, producing financial projections that showed the true scope of the planned theft. It was about creating a public scandal that would destroy your professional reputation and make it impossible for you to practice law anywhere in the country. The projections were chilling. After the theft was discovered, Amanda would claim that Marcus had pressured her into the fraud, that he'd used his position and experience to manipulate a young woman into criminal activity. The media coverage would paint him as a predatory older man who'd exploited his professional standing to corrupt an innocent victim. Phase 3 of Harrison's plan, I said, turning to a new section of documents, involved Amanda disappearing with the stolen funds while simultaneously filing charges against you for coercion and fraud. You would have been disbarred, criminally prosecuted, and left with nothing while Harrison's daughter disappeared with millions of your money. Marcus was now openly weeping, the full scope of the betrayal finally sinking in. His former best friend had spent years orchestrating the most intimate violation possible, using personal relationships to destroy everything Marcus had built over his career. But here's what makes this even more twisted, I continued, producing photographs that would shatter Amanda's world just as thoroughly as Marcus's had been destroyed. Harrison didn't tell you the whole truth about your target, did he, Amanda? The photographs showed Harrison Pemberton in various locations around Boston, but he wasn't alone. In every image, he was accompanied by Elena Vasquez, the same Elena who'd been infiltrating our household and feeding information to Amanda's criminal network. "Your father has been working with Elena's criminal organization for 5 years, I announced, watching Amanda's face cycle through disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. Harrison Pemberton isn't just a lawyer seeking revenge. He's a criminal who's been using his law firm to launder money for Elena's theft operation. The documents I spread across the table revealed the shocking truth. Pemberton, Hayes & Associates had been serving as the legal front for Elena's nationwide criminal enterprise, helping to legitimize stolen assets and providing legal protection for the network's activities. "The Morrison Industries case that destroyed your friendship?" I said to Marcus. "Harrison didn't win it through superior legal work. He won it because Elena had infiltrated Morrison's household and stolen their litigation strategy, which Harrison then used to anticipate and counter every move you made. The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. Marcus's greatest professional defeat hadn't been the result of his inadequacy or Harrison's brilliance. It had been the product of criminal conspiracy and theft. Amanda, your father has been using you as an unwitting asset in a criminal enterprise that goes far beyond personal revenge," I explained, producing FBI surveillance photographs that showed Harrison meeting with known money launderers and organized crime figures. "Every dollar you've stolen, every family you've helped destroy, has been feeding a network that your father has been profiting from for years." Amanda was now hyperventilating as the scope of her father's deception became clear. She thought she was helping him settle an old score with a professional rival. Instead, she'd been participating in organized crime while her own father collected profits from her activities and planned to sacrifice her as a scapegoat when the operation was discovered. The beautiful irony, I continued, is that Harrison's plan to destroy Marcus would have ultimately destroyed you as well, Amanda. Once the theft was discovered and you were arrested, your father would have disavowed any knowledge of your activities. You would have faced federal charges while he maintained plausible deniability and kept the stolen money. The FBI surveillance files revealed that Harrison had been planning to eliminate Amanda as a liability once she'd served her purpose. He'd already prepared legal documents that would distance his law firm from her activities and position him as another victim of her supposed criminal enterprise. Your father never intended for you to escape this scheme, I said, my voice taking on an almost gentle tone as I delivered the final blow to Amanda's worldview. He was planning to have you killed once the money was safely transferred to accounts he controlled. Elena's network doesn't leave witnesses, and Harrison knew that from the beginning. The silence that followed was profound. Amanda stared at the surveillance photographs with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of family loyalty had been shattered. Her father hadn't just used her as a criminal asset. He'd planned her murder to protect his own interests. Marcus was looking between the documents and Amanda with something approaching sympathy, recognizing that they'd both been victims of a conspiracy that went far deeper than either of them had understood. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "How could you possibly know all of this? The FBI surveillance, Harrison's criminal connections, Elena's real identity. This isn't information that any private citizen could access." I smiled, finally allowing a hint of satisfaction to show on my face. The evening's biggest revelation was still to come, and it would reshape everything they thought they knew about me, about our marriage, and about why I'd been able to uncover a criminal conspiracy that had evaded law enforcement for years. "Marcus, darling," I said, reaching into my briefcase for the leather credential case that would change everything. "There's something important I need to tell you about my actual profession." The moment of truth had arrived, and neither of them was prepared for what they were about to learn about the quiet woman they'd so thoroughly underestimated. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a leather credential case that had remained hidden throughout the evening's revelations. The weight of it in my hands represented 23 years of carefully constructed lies, a double life so thoroughly maintained that even my own husband had never suspected the truth. "Before I show you this," I said, opening the case with deliberate ceremony, "I want you both to understand that everything you think you know about me, about our marriage, about how I've managed to uncover this conspiracy, is about to change." The credentials inside bore the official seal of the United States Department of Justice, specifically the Organized Crime Strike Force. My photograph stared back from an identification card that listed my rank as Senior Special Agent and my clearance level as classified. Catherine Elizabeth Morrison, I read from the official documentation, DOJ badge number 4721, assigned to the Financial Crimes Task Force since 2003, specialized in long-term undercover operations targeting white-collar criminal enterprises. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at the federal badge with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just collapsed. Amanda's face had gone white as she realized the true magnitude of her predicament. She hadn't just been caught by an angry wife, she'd been arrested by a federal agent. 25 years ago, when we met at that charity gala, I continued, addressing Marcus directly, I wasn't just a young professional looking for love. I was Agent Catherine Morrison, recently graduated from Quantico, on my first major undercover assignment, investigating financial irregularities in Chicago's legal community. I withdrew a thick file from my briefcase, one that contained surveillance photographs, financial analyses, and investigative reports dating back to our earliest days together. The documentation painted a picture that would reshape everything Marcus thought he knew about our relationship. The Department of Justice had received intelligence suggesting that several prestigious law firms were being used to launder money for organized crime syndicates, I explained, opening the file to reveal photographs of Marcus at various social events, business meetings, and professional conferences, all taken during federal surveillance operations. Hartwell, Morrison and Associates was one of 17 firms under investigation. Marcus's hands trembled as he absorbed photographs of himself from 25 years ago, Images he'd never known were being taken by federal agents who suspected him of criminal activity. The young, ambitious lawyer he'd been had no idea that his entire social circle was under surveillance by an organized crime task force. "Your law firm wasn't randomly successful, Marcus," I continued, producing financial records that showed patterns of suspicious transactions dating back to the firm's early years. "The initial capital that allowed you to expand so rapidly came from clients who were later identified as money launderers for the Torino crime family." The documents revealed a web of financial relationships that Marcus had been too naive or too ambitious to question when they'd first appeared. Large retainer fees from clients with questionable backgrounds, successful case outcomes that seemed too convenient, business opportunities that had fallen into his lap with suspicious timing. All of it had been part of a criminal enterprise that had been using his firm as a front for illegal activities. "My assignment was supposed to last 6 months," I said, watching Marcus struggle to process the implications of what he was learning. "Just long enough to gather evidence of money laundering and identify the key players in the operation." But something unexpected happened during those 6 months. I paused, allowing the weight of what I was about to reveal to settle between us. This was the part of the story that even I had struggled to reconcile. The moment when a federal investigation had become complicated by genuine human emotion. "I fell in love with you," I admitted, my voice softening for the first time that evening. Not with the potential criminal I was investigating, but with the idealistic young lawyer who genuinely believed he was building something legitimate. "You were so passionate about justice, so committed to doing the right thing, that I began to suspect you might be as much a victim of the criminal enterprise as an accomplice." The investigation files contained detailed psychological profiles and behavioral analyses that painted Marcus as someone who was being manipulated rather than someone actively participating in criminal activity. His genuine surprise at unexpected windfalls, his consistent ethical behavior in cases that didn't involve the suspicious clients, his obvious discomfort when asked to bend legal rules, all of it suggested a man who was being used rather than someone who was actively criminal. "I requested an extension of my assignment to gather more evidence about your level of involvement," I continued, producing correspondence between myself and my supervisors at the Department of Justice. "What I discovered over the next year was that you were the perfect cover for a money laundering operation precisely because you were legitimate. The criminal organization had specifically targeted Marcus because of his integrity and naivete. They needed a law firm that could provide genuine legal services while occasionally handling transactions that served their illegal purposes. Marcus's honest reputation provided legitimacy for the entire operation, while his inexperience prevented him from recognizing the warning signs of criminal activity." "The Morrison Industries case," I said, opening to a new section of documents that would explain one of the most pivotal moments in Marcus's career, "was actually a federal sting operation designed to expose the money laundering network that had been using your firm." Marcus stared at me with growing horror as he realized the implications. The case that had made his reputation, the victory that had established him as one of Chicago's premier corporate lawyers, had been orchestrated by federal agents as part of a criminal investigation. "We allowed you to win because we needed the criminal organization to believe their money laundering operation was secure," I explained, producing transcripts of federal planning meetings where Marcus's case had been discussed as a tactical element in a larger investigation. "Your success convinced them to move larger amounts of money through your firm, which gave us the evidence we needed to make arrests." The federal operation had been extraordinarily successful. 17 separate criminal organizations had been dismantled, over $400 million in illegal assets had been seized, and dozens of high-ranking criminals had been convicted. But the personal cost had been enormous for everyone involved, particularly for Marcus, who had built his career on what he now understood was an elaborate federal deception. "After the arrests were made and the criminal network was destroyed," I continued, "I faced a choice that would define the rest of my career. I could reveal my true identity to you and end our relationship, or I could request permanent reassignment to maintain my cover identity while transitioning to a new type of investigation." The documents showed that I had requested and received approval for long-term deep cover status, allowing me to remain married to Marcus while conducting investigations into other criminal enterprises that targeted the legal and financial communities. "For 25 years, I've been Agent Catherine Morrison, using my position as your wife to investigate white-collar crimes throughout the Midwest, I explained, producing case files that showed the scope of my activities over the past quarter century. The charity work, the social events, the business connections, all of it has been part of ongoing federal investigations into organized crime. The revelation was staggering in its implications. Our entire marriage had been, from my perspective, an extended undercover operation. Every anniversary dinner, every family vacation, every intimate moment had been part of a federal investigation that had been running for over 2 decades. "Amanda," I said, turning my attention to the young woman who was now staring at me with undisguised terror, "you and your father's criminal enterprise have been under federal surveillance for 3 years. Elena's network, Harrison's money laundering operation, even your romance scam activities. All of it has been documented as part of Operation Clean Sweep, the largest white-collar crime investigation in DOJ history." I withdrew another file, this one bearing multiple federal agency seals and classification markings. The operation had involved coordination between the FBI, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the Internal Revenue Service, and international law enforcement agencies in 7 countries. "Tonight wasn't about our anniversary," I said, allowing my federal authority to show in my voice for the first time. "Tonight was the culmination of a 3-year investigation that will result in the arrest of over 200 individuals across 12 states and the seizure of approximately $1.2 billion in criminal assets." As if summoned by my words, I heard the unmistakable sound of car doors closing in the country club's parking lot. Through the dining room windows, I could see black SUVs arriving with the precision of a military operation. "Amanda Pemberton, Marcus Hartwell," I said, my voice taking on the official tone I used when making arrests. "You're both under federal surveillance as part of an ongoing investigation. Agents will be joining us momentarily to discuss your options for cooperation with federal prosecutors." The evening that had begun with Marcus's arrogant announcement of his new wife was about to end with both of them in federal custody, while the woman they'd both underestimated revealed herself to be one of the most successful undercover agents in DOJ history. The transformation was complete. Catherine Hartwell, the quiet corporate wife, had died, and Agent Catherine Morrison had been reborn to deliver justice with the full authority of the United States government. The elegant dining room of Bellmont Country Club transformed into a federal crime scene with surgical precision. Special Agent David Chen entered first, his practiced eyes scanning the room before settling on our table with the focused intensity of someone who'd been planning this moment for months. Behind him came Agent Sarah Rodriguez and Agent Michael Thompson, their coordinated movements speaking to years of experience in high-profile arrests. "Agent Morrison," Chen said, approaching our table with the respectful deference reserved for senior operatives. "We have confirmation that all primary targets are in custody. Harrison Pemberton was arrested at his Boston office 47 minutes ago." The words hit Amanda like physical blows. Her father, the man who'd orchestrated this entire conspiracy, was already in federal custody, while she sat trapped in this elegant restaurant, realizing that her criminal empire was collapsing in real time. "Outstanding," I replied, checking my watch with the practiced precision of someone who'd coordinated dozens of multi-jurisdiction operations. "And the financial assets? Frozen as of 2,100 hours, Agent Rodriguez confirmed, producing a tablet that displayed real-time seizure notifications. "The offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets, the shell company holdings, everything's locked down pending federal forfeiture proceedings." Marcus was staring at the federal agents with the expression of a man watching his own execution. Every escape route he might have imagined, fleeing to one of his hidden accounts, calling in favors from powerful clients, leveraging his legal connections, was being systematically eliminated before his eyes. Elena Vasquez, Agent Thompson announced, consulting his secure phone, was arrested at Chicago O'Hare, attempting to board a flight to Mexico City. She was carrying $340,000 in cash and falsified documents for 3 different identities. Amanda's hands were trembling as she absorbed the scope of the federal operation. The network she'd believed was untouchable, the criminal enterprise that had seemed so sophisticated and secure, was being dismantled with the efficiency of a military campaign. "Marcus Hartwell," Agent Chen said, turning his attention to my husband with the clinical detachment of someone who'd made thousands of arrests. "You're under federal investigation for money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice." The Miranda rights that followed seemed to echo in the suddenly silent dining room. Other diners had begun to notice the commotion, their romantic anniversary celebrations interrupted by the sight of federal agents conducting arrests at the table by the window. "Wait," Marcus gasped, his voice barely audible above the sound of handcuffs being prepared. "I didn't know about any of this." "Catherine, Agent Morrison, she said I was a victim, that I was being used by criminals without my knowledge." Agent Chen paused, consulting a thick file that contained what appeared to be years of surveillance documentation. "Mr. Hartwell, while it's true that you were initially unaware of the criminal enterprise using your law firm, our investigation has uncovered evidence of knowing participation in illegal activities over the past 18 months. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as Chen opened the file to reveal surveillance photographs that I hadn't seen before. The images showed Marcus in various locations, conducting meetings and financial transactions that looked far more deliberate than the naive compliance I'd believed him guilty of. "The Henderson Real Estate Investments," Chen continued, placing photographs on the table that showed Marcus meeting with known money launderers in hotel lobbies and private clubs. "The offshore consulting fees through Cayman Island shell companies. The systematic inflation of legal billing to accommodate cash payments from criminal clients." Marcus's face went white as he stared at evidence of activities that couldn't be explained as innocent mistakes or unknowing participation. The timestamps on the photographs showed a pattern of behavior that had been building over nearly 2 years, suggesting a level of criminal sophistication that I hadn't suspected. "Agent Morrison," Chen said, turning to me with an expression that contained both respect and disappointment. "I'm afraid your husband's criminal activities extend beyond what our initial investigation revealed. He wasn't just being used by the criminal network, he'd become an active participant." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. 25 years of believing that Marcus was fundamentally innocent, that he was a victim of circumstances rather than a willing criminal, shattered in an instant. The man I'd loved, the idealistic young lawyer I'd married while maintaining my federal cover, had become exactly the kind of criminal I'd spent my career pursuing. "The beautiful irony," Agent Rodriguez said, consulting her own tablet, "is that Mr. Hartwell's criminal activities were actually separate from the Pemberton conspiracy. He was running his own money laundering operation while simultaneously being targeted by a different criminal enterprise." Marcus was now openly weeping as the full scope of his legal jeopardy became clear. He wasn't just facing charges related to Amanda's conspiracy. He was facing federal prosecution for crimes he'd committed independently, crimes that carried decades of prison time. "Amanda Pemberton," Agent Thompson announced, turning his attention to the young woman who was now hyperventilating with panic. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit economic espionage, wire fraud, and participation in a continuing criminal enterprise." The handcuffs clicked into place with a finality that seemed to echo throughout the dining room. Amanda's elaborate con wasn't just over. It had never really begun. She'd been under federal surveillance from the moment she'd entered Marcus's life. Every crime documented by agents who'd been building an unassailable case against her and her criminal network. "I want to make a deal," Amanda gasped, her voice barely audible as the reality of federal prosecution set in. "I have information about other operations, other targets. My father's network extends across the entire country. You'll have plenty of opportunity to discuss cooperation with federal prosecutors," I said, my voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who'd watched this scene play out countless times. "Though you should know that your father is probably making similar offers as we speak, which significantly reduces the value of your testimony." The restaurant's maître d' approached discreetly, clearly experienced in handling unusual situations with minimal disruption to other guests. A few whispered words ensured that the arrests would be conducted with as much dignity as possible, though there was no hiding the sight of 2 well-dressed individuals being led away in federal custody. As the agents prepared to escort them out, Marcus turned back to me with desperation in his eyes. "Catherine, Agent Morrison, 25 years. Were any of it real? Did you ever actually love me, or was it all just part of your investigation?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that would haunt me long after tonight's operation was complete. How do you answer someone who's asking whether your entire marriage was an elaborate federal deception? "The investigation was real," I said finally, my voice softer than it had been all evening. "But so were my feelings. I fell in love with the man I thought you were, Marcus. The tragedy is that you chose to become someone else. It was perhaps the most honest thing I had said all evening, and also the most painful. 25 years of marriage, of building a life together, of believing we were partners in something meaningful. All of it had been built on foundations that were shifting and uncertain from the very beginning. Agent Chen returned after securing the prisoners in federal transport vehicles. Agent Morrison, the Chicago field office is requesting a preliminary debrief. Should we schedule for tomorrow morning? Make it 0800 hours, I replied, gathering the documents with practiced efficiency. I'll need to coordinate with the Boston field office regarding Harrison Pemberton's prosecution, and we'll want to begin plea negotiations while the shock of arrest is still fresh. As the agents departed, I remained seated at our table, surrounded by the scattered evidence of months of meticulous planning. The other diners had resumed their conversations, the brief excitement of the arrests already fading into whispered speculation about what they'd witnessed. My secure phone buzzed with a message from DOJ Director Williams. Congratulations on Operation Clean Sweep. Preliminary reports suggest this may be the most comprehensive white-collar takedown in department history. Outstanding work, Agent Morrison. The professional satisfaction was immense. 3 years of investigation had culminated in the dismantling of multiple criminal enterprises and the seizure of over $1 billion in illegal assets. But the personal cost was devastating. My marriage was over, my cover identity was blown, and 25 years of carefully constructed relationships would need to be abandoned. I opened my laptop and began typing the preliminary case summary that would become part of federal prosecution files, each word documenting the end of one life and the beginning of another. The evening that had begun with Marcus's arrogant announcement of his new wife was ending with both conspirators in federal custody, while the woman they'd underestimated revealed herself to be one of the most successful undercover agents in DOJ history. But as I sat alone in the dining room where I'd planned to celebrate our 25th anniversary, I couldn't escape the haunting question Marcus had asked. In the pursuit of justice, how much of my own humanity had I sacrificed? And was the cost worth the victory I'd achieved? But was a sechalsi Yahwas. The answers to those questions would define whatever came next in a life that was about to be completely transformed. Yahwan sechalsi Yahal. 3 months after the arrests at Bellmont Country Club, I stood in the federal courthouse in Chicago, watching as the final defendant in Operation Clean Sweep received his sentence. Harrison Pemberton, once one of Boston's most prestigious attorneys, now wore the orange jumpsuit of federal custody, as Judge Morrison pronounced the words that would define the rest of his life. 35 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole before 28 years served, the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. The court finds that your exploitation of the legal profession to facilitate organized crime represents a fundamental betrayal of public trust that demands the harshest possible sentence. Harrison's empire had been systematically dismantled over the past 90 days. His law firm had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to the dozens of families his network had destroyed. His professional reputation, built over 30 years of successful practice, had been obliterated by revelations of criminal conspiracy that had shocked the legal community nationwide. But it was Amanda's sentencing 2 weeks earlier that had provided the most sobering reminder of the human cost of criminal enterprise. 22 years in federal prison for someone who had barely lived that long. Her child, the pregnancy had been real, though the father remained uncertain, would be born in federal custody and raised in witness protection, while Amanda served a sentence that would consume the remainder of her young adulthood. Agent Morrison, came a voice behind me as I exited the courthouse. I turned to see Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor who had masterfully orchestrated the complex web of federal charges that had brought down the entire network. "Counselor," I replied, shaking hands with the woman whose legal brilliance had turned months of investigation into airtight prosecutions. "Congratulations on the conviction. 35 years is exactly what Harrison deserved." Jennifer's expression was professional, but tinged with something that might have been sympathy. "I wanted to thank you personally for the quality of evidence you provided. The recordings, the financial documentation, the surveillance materials. It was some of the most comprehensive investigative work I've ever seen. The praise was gratifying from a professional standpoint, but it carried a personal weight that was difficult to bear. Every recording she mentioned had been made in my own home. Every financial document had been gathered through the betrayal of my husband's trust. Every piece of surveillance had been conducted on people who had believed I was their friend. "There is one more matter we need to discuss," Jennifer continued, her tone shifting to something more serious. "Marcus's plea hearing is scheduled for next week. His attorney has been pushing for a cooperation agreement, but given the scope of his independent criminal activities, the department is reluctant to offer significant sentencing reductions." Marcus. The name still sent a complex mix of emotions through me. Anger at his betrayal, grief for the man I'd thought I'd married, and guilt over the role my own deception had played in the destruction of our lives. "What's his exposure looking like?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from reading the prosecution memos that crossed my desk. "Without cooperation, he's looking at 20 to 25 years, Jennifer replied. "His money laundering operation was more sophisticated than we initially realized. The Henderson real estate scheme alone moved over $8 million in criminal proceeds, and that was just one of several parallel operations he was running." 25 years. Marcus was 53 years old, which meant he would likely die in federal prison. The idealistic young lawyer I'd fallen in love with during my first undercover assignment had become exactly the kind of criminal I'd spent my career pursuing. "Has he provided any useful intelligence about other criminal enterprises?" I asked, trying to maintain the clinical detachment that had served me throughout this investigation. "Some," Jennifer admitted. "He's identified several clients who were using his firm for money laundering, and he's provided details about a cryptocurrency operation that we hadn't previously discovered, but nothing that would justify a substantial reduction in his sentence." We walked through the courthouse corridors in silence, passing the marble monuments to justice that had presided over the destruction of so many lives over the past few months. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent 25 years working within the system to uphold the law, only to discover that my closest personal relationship had been built on systematic criminality. "Agent Morrison," Jennifer said as we reached the courthouse entrance, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are you handling all of this personally? 25 years of marriage, discovering that your husband was a criminal. It must be incredibly difficult." The question was one I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. How do you process the revelation that your entire adult life has been built on lies? That the person you shared a bed with for a quarter century was systematically stealing money and facilitating criminal enterprises while you worked to bring exactly those kinds of people to justice? "Professional compartmentalization," I replied, using the clinical language that helped me avoid confronting the emotional reality of my situation. "The investigation was successful, the prosecutions were solid, and justice has been served. Everything else is secondary." But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't entirely true. The professional success couldn't erase the personal devastation, and the satisfaction of bringing criminals to justice couldn't fill the void left by the destruction of everything I'd thought I understood about my own life. My phone buzzed with a secure message from DOJ Director Williams. "Agent Morrison, your request for extended leave has been approved. Take all the time you need to process recent events. Your contributions to Operation Clean Sweep have been exceptional, and the department recognizes the personal sacrifices you've made in service to justice." Extended leave. It was a bureaucratic way of acknowledging that I was experiencing what the department psychologists called operational burnout, the inevitable result of maintaining deep cover for extended periods while dealing with the psychological trauma of betrayal by those closest to you. I drove through Chicago's downtown district, past the law offices where Marcus had built his reputation, past the restaurants where we'd celebrated anniversaries and milestones, past the hotel where we'd spent our wedding night 25 years ago. Every familiar landmark carried memories that had been poisoned by the revelation of his criminal activities. My phone rang as I sat in traffic, the caller ID showing my sister Rebecca's number. She was the only family member who knew the truth about my federal career, and she'd been my primary emotional support throughout the investigation and its aftermath. "Catherine," she said as soon as I answered, "I've been worried about you. You haven't returned my calls for 2 weeks. I've been busy with the prosecutions, I replied, though we both knew that wasn't the real reason for my isolation. Harrison Pemberton was sentenced today. 35 years. That's wonderful, Rebecca said, though her tone suggested she was more concerned about my well-being than the success of federal prosecutions. But I'm more interested in how you're doing. When was the last time you slept through the night? When was the last time you ate a real meal, instead of surviving on coffee and determination? The questions were uncomfortable because they forced me to confront the physical and emotional toll of the past few months. The successful completion of Operation Clean Sweep had required a level of focus and energy that had left me physically exhausted and emotionally depleted. I'm fine, I said, using the automatic response that federal agents were trained to give when asked about their psychological state. The operation was successful, and the criminals are in prison where they belong. Catherine, Rebecca said, her voice taking on the firm tone she'd used when we were children, and she was trying to talk sense into me. You spent 25 years married to a man who turned out to be a criminal. You've just completed the most complex undercover operation in DOJ history. You're allowed to not be fine. The simple acknowledgement of my right to be struggling hit me harder than any of the evening's revelations had. For months, I'd been so focused on the professional requirements of building cases and securing convictions that I'd neglected to process the personal implications of what I'd discovered. I don't know how to be anything other than Agent Morrison anymore, I admitted, finally allowing some vulnerability to enter my voice. Catherine Hartwell was a cover identity that I maintained for so long that I'm not sure who I really am underneath all the deception. The confession was more honest than anything I'd said since the arrests began. 25 years of deep cover had blurred the lines between my authentic self and my operational persona, to the point where I wasn't sure which thoughts and feelings were genuine and which were part of an elaborate federal performance. Come stay with me for a while, Rebecca offered. Take some time away from Chicago, away from the reminders of everything that's happened. You need to figure out who Catherine Morrison is when she's not investigating criminals or maintaining cover identities. The offer was tempting, but it also represented a fundamental shift that I wasn't sure I was ready to make. Leaving Chicago would mean abandoning the life I'd built, even if that life had been largely fictional. It would mean confronting the reality that I was 52 years old and had no idea who I was outside of my federal career. As I sat in traffic, watching the city that had been my home and my hunting ground for over 2 decades, I realized that the most difficult investigation of my career was just beginning. The investigation into my own identity and what remained of my authentic self after 25 years of living a lie in service to justice. The criminals were in prison, the stolen money had been recovered, and justice had been served. But the woman who had delivered that justice was about to discover that the greatest challenge lay not in bringing down criminal enterprises, but in rebuilding a life that had been sacrificed in the pursuit of something larger than herself. 6 months after Operation Clean Sweep concluded, I found myself sitting in the sterile visiting room of Federal Correctional Institution Thompson, staring across a metal table at the man I'd been married to for 25 years. Marcus looked older than his 53 years, the confident attorney who'd once commanded boardrooms replaced by someone who seemed diminished by the reality of federal prison. Catherine, he said, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and desperation that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure you'd come. I'd driven 3 hours from Rebecca's house in Wisconsin to this medium security facility in Illinois, wrestling with the decision every mile of the way. What do you say to someone who'd been both your greatest love and your most significant professional target? How do you have a conversation with a person whose entire identity, like your own, had been built on elaborate deceptions? I needed to see you, I replied, studying his face for traces of the idealistic young lawyer I'd fallen in love with 27 years ago. I needed to understand how we got here. Marcus's hands were folded on the table between us, his wedding ring conspicuously absent. The federal marshals had cataloged and stored everything that had connected him to his previous life, including the symbols of a marriage that had been built on lies from both sides. The money laundering, I said, cutting through the awkward pleasantries that felt obscene given our circumstances. When did it start? When did you make the decision to become the kind of person I spent my career pursuing? Marcus's eyes closed briefly, and I could see him wrestling with whether to continue the deceptions that had defined our relationship, or finally tell the truth about who he'd become. 3 years ago, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. After the Patterson Industries case fell through. After I realized that playing by the rules wasn't enough to compete with firms that were willing to bend them. The timeline coincided with my own recollections of when Marcus had started changing, when the idealistic lawyer had begun showing signs of the cynicism and moral flexibility that would eventually lead him to crime. The Henderson real estate investments weren't about building wealth, Catherine. They were about survival. Do you know what it's like to watch younger, less experienced attorneys win cases because they have access to resources and information that legitimate practice can't provide? I studied his face as he spoke, searching for signs of genuine remorse versus the self-justification that career criminals use to rationalize their choices. Marcus was explaining his criminal activities as if they'd been inevitable responses to market pressures, rather than deliberate decisions to break the law. So you decided to level the playing field by becoming a criminal yourself, I said, my training as a federal agent overriding the emotional complexity of confronting my husband's betrayal. I decided to do whatever was necessary to preserve everything we'd built together, Marcus replied, his voice carrying a note of defensiveness that suggested he still didn't fully grasp the magnitude of his crimes. The house, the lifestyle, your respect. I couldn't bear the thought of losing it all because I was too ethical to compete. The irony was breathtaking. Marcus had become a criminal to preserve a marriage with a woman who was secretly a federal agent, dedicated to pursuing exactly his kind of crimes. He'd destroyed everything he'd claimed to be protecting through the very actions he'd taken to preserve it. Marcus, I said, leaning forward with the intensity I'd once reserved for interrogating suspects. Did you ever suspect? In 25 years of marriage, did you ever question who I really was? The question hung between us like a confession. I was asking whether my cover had been so thorough that even the person closest to me had never seen through the elaborate fiction I'd maintained for over 2 decades. There were moments, Marcus admitted, his voice taking on a thoughtful quality that reminded me of the analytical mind that had first attracted me to him. Times when you seemed to know things about financial crimes that went beyond casual interest. Times when you asked questions that felt more like professional curiosity than personal concern. He paused, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. But I convinced myself that you were just naturally observant, that your questions came from wanting to understand my work better. I never imagined that you were documenting everything for federal prosecution. The conversation was surreal in its intimacy, and devastating in its implications. We were finally being completely honest with each other, but only after both our lives had been destroyed by the lies we'd maintained. The night of our anniversary dinner, Marcus continued, when you started revealing everything you knew about Amanda and Elena and Harrison's conspiracy, I remember thinking that you were impossibly well informed for someone whose only source should have been gossip and speculation. I nodded, remembering the moment when I'd seen recognition dawning in his eyes, the instant when he'd begun to suspect that his wife was more than she appeared to be. But even then, I never imagined you were a federal agent. I thought maybe you'd hired private investigators, or that you had business connections I didn't know about. The idea that you were law enforcement, that our entire marriage was part of an undercover operation, never occurred to me. The admission was both gratifying and heartbreaking. My cover had been so thorough that even my husband had never suspected, but that thoroughness had also meant that our relationship had been built on a foundation of deception that neither of us had been able to recognize. Catherine, Marcus said, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone making a final appeal, was any of it real? The love? The partnership? The life we built together? Or was it all just an elaborate federal performance? The question was one I'd been avoiding since the night at Bellmont Country Club. But sitting across from him in federal prison, I realized he deserved an honest answer, even if it was painful for both of us. The assignment was real, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken to him that night. But so were my feelings. I fell in love with the man I thought you were, Marcus. The tragedy is that we both chose to become people we never should have been. Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he absorbed the implication of what I was saying, that our love had been genuine but ultimately destroyed by the professional and criminal choices we'd both made. If you could go back, he asked, if you could choose differently, would you still take the assignment? Would you still agree to marry someone as part of a federal investigation? The question forced me to confront the fundamental tension that had defined my adult life. The choice between personal happiness and professional duty, between authentic relationships and the pursuit of justice. I don't know, I admitted, surprised by my own uncertainty. 27 years ago, I believed that justice was worth any personal sacrifice. That bringing down criminal enterprises justified whatever deception was necessary. Now I'm not sure the cost was worth the outcome. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us contemplating the wreckage of lives that had been built on noble intentions but destroyed by the compromises those intentions had required. The federal psychologist I've been seeing, Marcus said finally, keeps asking me to identify the moment when I chose criminality over integrity. But I don't think there was a single moment, Catherine. I think it was a series of small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time, that eventually led me somewhere I never intended to go. His analysis was probably accurate, and it applied as much to my own choices as to his. I'd started with a 6-month assignment to investigate financial crimes, but through a series of extensions and rationalizations, I'd ended up spending 25 years living a lie that had ultimately destroyed both our lives. Marcus, I said as our visiting time neared its end, I need you to know that despite everything that's happened, despite all the lies and betrayals, the love was real. The man I married, the idealistic young lawyer who believed in justice and wanted to make the world better, that person was real, and I loved him completely. Marcus reached across the table as if to take my hand, then stopped himself, remembering the federal regulations that prohibited physical contact during visits. The woman I married, he replied. The brilliant, compassionate person who supported my dreams and challenged me to be better. She was real too. And I loved her more than I've ever been able to express. As I left Federal Correctional Institution Thompson and drove back toward Wisconsin, I realized that the conversation had provided something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not the neat resolution that movies promised, but the messy, complicated acknowledgement that love and betrayal could coexist. That genuine emotion could survive even the most elaborate deceptions. Marcus would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, and I would spend that same time rebuilding an identity that had been sacrificed to the pursuit of justice. That for the first time since Operation Clean Sweep had ended, I believed that both of us might eventually find some measure of peace with the choices we'd made and the consequences we'd have to live with. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was finally built on truth rather than the elaborate fictions that had defined our lives for so long. 2 years after Operation Clean Sweep concluded, I stood in the sunlit conference room of Morrison Consulting Group, looking out over downtown Seattle's business district as I prepared for the most important presentation of my new career. The irony of the company name wasn't lost on me. I'd chosen to use my real surname, Catherine Morrison, for the first time in over 25 years. Catherine, said James Fletcher, the CEO of Pacific Northwest Financial Services, as he reviewed the comprehensive fraud prevention proposal I'd prepared for his company. Your background is impressive, but I have to ask, what made you transition from federal law enforcement to private consulting? It was a question I'd learned to answer with carefully chosen honesty over the past 18 months, as I'd built a new professional identity from the ground up. The truth was too complex for most client meetings, but the principles behind it had become the foundation of everything I was trying to build. I spent 25 years working undercover operations, I replied, my voice carrying the quiet authority that came from decades of federal experience. I learned that the most sophisticated criminals aren't the ones who break into banks. They're the ones who convince you to hand over the keys. My expertise is in understanding how trust gets weaponized, and how good people get manipulated into making terrible decisions. James nodded approvingly as he flipped through the presentation materials that outlined a comprehensive approach to corporate fraud prevention. The proposal was unlike anything his company had seen before. Instead of focusing solely on technical security measures, it emphasized psychological vulnerabilities and human factors that made organizations susceptible to sophisticated cons. The Pemberton case study you've included here, James said, pointing to a section that detailed Harrison's law firm conspiracy without mentioning my personal involvement. The level of insight into criminal methodology is remarkable. How did you gain access to this kind of intelligence? I was the lead federal agent on that investigation, I replied simply. allowing the weight of that statement to settle between us. I spent 3 years documenting how a prestigious law firm was systematically corrupted by organized crime. The case taught me that traditional security measures are useless against criminals who understand how to exploit human psychology. Over the past 2 years, I discovered that my unique background, federal law enforcement experience combined with intimate knowledge of how intelligent people rationalize criminal behavior, made me exceptionally qualified to help organizations identify and prevent sophisticated fraud schemes. Morrison Consulting Group had grown from a one-person operation run out of Rebecca's guest bedroom to a team of 12 specialists who provided fraud prevention services to major corporations across the Pacific Northwest. Our client list included 3 Fortune 500 companies, 2 major law firms, and a dozen financial institutions that had learned to value expertise over traditional credentials. The psychological profiling component is particularly interesting, James continued, studying the section that outlined how we identified employees who might be vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. How do you screen for susceptibility to corruption without violating privacy rights? It was a sophisticated question that demonstrated why Pacific Northwest Financial had survived and thrived while other regional firms had fallen victim to various fraud schemes over the past decade. We don't investigate employees, I explained, opening to a section that detailed our methodology. We analyze organizational culture and identify systemic vulnerabilities that criminals typically exploit. Employees who feel undervalued, overlooked for promotion, or financially stressed become targets for criminal recruitment. Our job is to help companies address those vulnerabilities before they become security risks. The approach had proven remarkably effective. In 18 months of operation, Morrison Consulting Group had helped prevent 7 major fraud attempts, identified 12 employees who were being actively recruited by criminal organizations, and saved our clients an estimated $340 million in potential losses. The reference list is impressive, James said, reviewing testimonials from clients who had implemented our recommendations. Northwest Bancorp credits you with preventing what could have been a $50 million cryptocurrency theft. How exactly did that work? We identified that their IT director was being systematically cultivated by a romance scammer who was actually part of an organized criminal network. I replied, remembering the case that had established our reputation in the financial services industry. The relationship had been developing for 8 months, and the criminal was preparing to request access to the bank's cryptocurrency security protocols. We intervened before any sensitive information was compromised. The Northwest Bancorp case had been particularly satisfying because it demonstrated how my federal experience could be applied to prevent crimes rather than simply prosecute them after the damage was done. The IT director, a brilliant but lonely woman in her 40s, had been targeted with surgical precision by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit her personal vulnerabilities. Catherine, James said, closing the proposal and leaning back in his chair, I am prepared to approve the full consulting contract. But I'm curious about something personal, if you don't mind me asking. After 25 years in federal law enforcement, what made you choose Seattle for your new venture? The question touched on something I'd been processing throughout my recovery from the psychological trauma of Operation Clean Sweep. Why had I chosen to rebuild my life in a city where I had no history, no connections, no reminders of the elaborate fiction I'd maintained for over 2 decades? I needed to discover who Catherine Morrison really was, I replied, surprised by my own willingness to be vulnerable with a client. For 25 years, I was Agent Morrison, federal law enforcement, defined entirely by my professional identity. I came to Seattle because I wanted to build something authentic from the ground up. James smiled with what appeared to be genuine understanding. That takes remarkable courage. Starting over at 54, building a new career in a new city, creating an identity that isn't defined by past achievements or relationships. The alternative was remaining trapped in a life that had been built on necessary deceptions, I said, thinking about the woman I'd been during my undercover years. I realized that I could either spend the rest of my life defined by what I'd sacrificed in service to justice, or I could use what I'd learned to build something meaningful going forward. As James signed the consulting contract that would expand Morrison Consulting Group's operations into the financial services sector, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who'd sat in Bellmont Country Club 2 years ago, systematically destroying the lives of criminals who'd underestimated her, was gone. In her place was someone who was still dedicated to fighting fraud and corruption, but through prevention rather than prosecution. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Sarah Chen, the federal psychologist who'd helped me process the trauma of discovering that my entire adult life had been built on elaborate deceptions. How did the Pacific Northwest financial presentation go? Remember that success in your new life doesn't diminish the value of your federal service. It builds on it. Dr. Chen had been instrumental in helping me understand that my 25 years as an undercover agent hadn't been wasted or meaningless, even though they'd cost me my marriage and required me to live a lie for decades. The skills I'd developed, the insights I'd gained, and the understanding of criminal psychology I'd acquired were all genuine assets that could be applied to legitimate purposes. Another message arrived, this one from Rebecca. Dinner tomorrow? I want to hear about the new contract, and I have news about the Morrison Foundation Scholarship Program. The Morrison Foundation was perhaps my greatest source of pride in my new life, using money I'd saved during my federal career, money that had accumulated because Agent Morrison had lived modestly while Catherine Hartwell had appeared wealthy. I'd established a scholarship program for children of incarcerated parents who wanted to pursue careers in law enforcement or criminal justice. The foundation had awarded its first scholarships 6 months ago. 12 young people whose parents were serving federal sentences would receive full college funding and mentorship support as they worked toward careers dedicated to preventing the kinds of crimes that had destroyed their families. Among the recipients was Elena Vasquez's daughter Maria, whose mother was serving 15 years for her role in the household infiltration conspiracy. Maria had written a heartbreaking essay about wanting to become an FBI agent so she could help prevent other families from being torn apart by criminal enterprises like the one that had corrupted her mother. Ms. Morrison, came a voice from behind me as I prepared to leave the Pacific Northwest financial offices. I turned to see Jennifer Walsh, the federal prosecutor who'd handled the Operation Clean Sweep cases, standing in the hallway with what appeared to be official documentation. Agent Morrison, I corrected automatically, then caught myself. Actually, it's just Catherine now. I'm no longer with the department. Jennifer smiled at my correction. I know. I'm here on behalf of DOJ Director Williams. He asked me to deliver this personally. She handed me an envelope bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice. Inside was a letter that would fundamentally change how I understood my federal service and its lasting impact. Agent Catherine Morrison, the letter began, the Department of Justice is pleased to inform you that Operation Clean Sweep has been selected as the recipient of this year's Attorney General's Award for Excellence in Criminal Investigation. Your 25 years of undercover service, culminating in the successful prosecution of 247 defendants and the seizure of $1.4 billion in criminal assets, represents the highest level of dedication to justice and public service. The letter went on to detail how Operation Clean Sweep had become a model for long-term undercover operations, and how the techniques I'd developed were being taught at the FBI Academy as part of advanced criminal investigation training. There's more, Jennifer said, watching as I read the formal recognition of work I'd thought would remain classified forever. The director wants to offer you a position as a senior consultant to the federal law enforcement training centers. You'd be developing curriculum for undercover operations and providing expertise for complex financial crime investigations. The offer was both flattering and tempting. It would mean returning to federal service, but in a capacity that would allow me to train the next generation of agents rather than maintaining elaborate cover identities myself. I'm honored by the offer, I replied, folding the letter carefully, but I think I'm exactly where I need to be right now. As Jennifer departed and I drove back to the downtown Seattle apartment that had become my sanctuary, I realized that for the first time in over 25 years, I was living a life that was entirely authentic. Catherine Morrison, private consultant and fraud prevention specialist, was who I had chosen to become rather than who I needed to be for professional purposes. The evening news was covering the final sentencing in Operation Clean Sweep. Elena Vasquez had received an additional 5 years for attempting to coordinate criminal activities from federal prison. Marcus's appeal had been denied, and he would serve his full 20-year sentence. Amanda Pemberton had given birth to a daughter while in custody and was participating in the Federal Witness Protection Program in exchange for her testimony against other criminal networks. But those stories felt like news from another lifetime. Reports about people who had intersected with my previous identity but who had no connection to the woman I was becoming. I opened my laptop and began working on a proposal for a new client, a technology company that was concerned about industrial espionage. The work was challenging, meaningful, and built on genuine expertise rather than elaborate deceptions. As the sun set over Elliott Bay, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. The woman who had walked into Bellmont Country Club 2 years ago had been Agent Catherine Morrison, federal law enforcement, defined entirely by her professional identity and the elaborate lies she maintained in service to justice. The woman sitting in this Seattle apartment was simply Catherine Morrison, consultant, mentor, and survivor of her own dedication to something larger than herself. She was flawed, complicated, and still discovering who she could become when she wasn't pretending to be someone else. But for the first time in decades, she was completely, authentically real. And that, I realized as I closed my laptop and prepared for sleep, was worth more than all the successful prosecutions and criminal convictions I'd achieved during my federal career. Justice was important, but so was truth. And the truth was that Catherine Morrison, whoever she was becoming, was finally free to find out. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.